The American Revolution, the great victory of liberty over tyranny for all freedom-loving American patriots. The way most of us imagine this tea-dumping spectacle usually involves a lot of fireworks, bald eagles, and the jolly singing of Yankee Doodle. But we here at SideQuest, my friends, know that history isn't so black and white, and that it oftentimes makes for awkward conversations at the dinner table. Because you see, not everyone in the 13 colonies rebelled against the British Empire. In fact, as much as a quarter of the colonial population at the time remained loyal to the crown. These loyalists came from all walks of life, from farmers and labourers to craftsmen, merchants, lawyers, soldiers, and clergymen. They had little in common, but their opposition to the revolution and their reasons for staying loyal were as diverse as their backgrounds. Many of the wealthier loyalists had strong ties to Britain, in some cases depending on the crown for their wealth. Poorer tenant farmers supported the crown to oppose their patriot landlords, while many recent immigrants from places like Scotland found it too risky to rebel. Others feared that democracy would devolve into mob rule, which indeed at many times it did. As one reverend put it, "It's better to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away than 3,000 tyrants nearby." And some just bet on the losing side, lest we forget, Great Britain was the hegemonic empire of the day, so it wasn't all that questionable to bet on it. And keep in mind, it wasn't just white colonists doing the betting. Thousands of black slaves sided with Britain to win their freedom, as did many Native Americans, correctly anticipating that the patriots would void the British treaties and invade their homelands. Now, while we're on the topic of homelands and heritage, I'd like to say a big thank you to MyHeritage for making this video possible. Over the past few weeks, I've been delving deep into the history of my family tree, and thanks to MyHeritage, I've managed to go back generations. As soon as I added the first few generations of my relatives, MyHeritage managed to dig up quite literally centuries of history. Here's one branch of my family tree that extends all the way back to the 11th century Oxfordshire. MyHeritage was able to find all this information thanks to advanced AI technology, and it helped me learn quite a lot about nearly everyone in my family tree. This is an article about my great-grandfather Harold when he became head of the International Labour Office in 1920. I particularly loved the Instant Discoveries feature. It really helped me build out the extra branches. It really is like magic. You just click on the button and you instantly get hundreds of matches going generations back. It does make sense. After all, MyHeritage has access to over 36 billion historical records. They also have a marvelous feature that lets you colorize old photographs, and you can even animate them using AI. But best of all, MyHeritage are offering a 14-day free trial to SideQuest subscribers if you click on the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on screen now. Click on the link to start your MyHeritage journey, and trust me, you won't want to end it after 14 days, as learning about your history is a very rewarding endeavour. But going back to the 18th century, altogether, some 500,000 people supported the crown against the patriots. Some passively, others by agitating, spying, or even taking up arms. Being a loyalist was a dangerous business, especially in the areas outside direct British occupation, as every single state passed confiscation acts to seize loyalist properties and to suspend their civil liberties. So, depending on where you lived, you couldn't vote, sell your land, sue in court, or work as any public profession. But perhaps worse than the legal threats were the extrajudicial mobs of patriots who roamed around cities and the countryside, searching for traitors to punish. These so-called committees of safety would demand you sign a patriot oath of allegiance renouncing the king. And if you didn't, you'd be tarred and feathered. which is a lot more painful than cartoons would have you believe. If you were unlucky, you'd get your house burned down and your possessions stolen, and if you were particularly unlucky, you'd just be killed. It is from this lovely period that we get the term lynching, named after the Patriot Colonel Charles Lynch, who organized makeshift courts in Virginia to judge Loyalists when the real courts were closed. Keep in mind that there was a lot of back and forth between the Patriots and the British in the 8 long years of the war. Cities and territories changed hands many times, as did loyalties. Britain occupied most major port cities, but had no realistic way of asserting control over the vast countryside stretching across the Atlantic seaboard. So, when one of its 2 armies was caught in a trap in 1781 at Yorktown, Britain's resolve for war crumbled. Parliament voted to cease all offensives, and the government of Prime Minister North collapsed. This left the Loyalists in a very awkward position. The crown they had sworn allegiance to had just called it quits from the 13 colonies, but it had yet to negotiate an actual peace settlement. And it was entirely unclear what would happen with all the confiscated property, which, presumably, had already been sold off by the states to pay for the war. Worse yet, the political persecution only escalated after the ceasefire. With the American courts reopened and Charles Lynch taking a long holiday, the expropriations and civil erasures could continue at a much greater pace. The Loyalists had to make a very difficult choice. They could stay on in the hostile political climate and try to ride out the storm by keeping their heads down, swearing allegiance to the flag, and definitely not asking for any of their property back. Or they could leave with whatever their backs could carry, hoping that Mother Britain would take them in and resettle them elsewhere in the empire, preferably with a nice plot of fertile land and a slave or 2 for company. To its credit, Britain did take it upon herself to protect and resettle the Loyalists who had fought for the crown. It organized a dozen different relief fleets with hundreds of ships to evacuate the Loyalists, and set up a Loyalist Claims Commission to compensate them. Unfortunately, by this point, Britain only held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, so prospective evacuees had to journey there on their own, risking robbery and violence along the way. By the time Britain signed the formal peace treaty of Paris in September 1783, some 70,000 people had fled the US for the safety of the British Empire. A final evacuation fleet departed New York on November the 25th, bringing the total to 80,000 refugees and marking the official end of British occupation of American cities. When all was said and done, 1 in every 30 Americans had fled the colonies. Around half of the exiles settled along the maritime coast of Canada, which wasn't a unified country back then, but a bunch of scattered colonies and trade posts. The population of British Canada at the time was only 160,000 people, most of whom were French speakers. So you can imagine how disruptive this sudden influx of exiles was. In the first years of resettlement, there was famine, disease, and banditry. But the Loyalist settlers nevertheless managed to survive and founded many cities. In some areas, the Loyalists outnumbered the locals, while in others they had to endure a fate worse than death, living under French language and law. To relieve them from such an unbearable burden, the king carved out 2 new provinces for the Loyalists from Quebec and Nova Scotia. And that's how today's Canadian provinces of New Brunswick and Ontario came to be. Oh, and see that on the flag of New Brunswick? That's one of the relief ships that sailed from New York carrying the Loyalists. Even more interesting is that in 1789, the Quebec government created for the Loyalists Canada's only hereditary honorific title. Those migrants who had fought for Britain could append UE for United Empire after their names, a title you can still rarely see today. And in the province of Ontario, you can get a special license plate for your car to celebrate your Loyalist heritage. Now, it is worth noting that the black Loyalists who emigrated to Canada fared a lot worse than their white compatriots. They were given the worst land, the fewest supplies, and had to endure racism that was just barely shy of being enslaved again. The situation got so bad that the black Loyalists petitioned Britain for a second resettlement, and this time they emigrated all the way to West Africa, where they created the future country of Sierra Leone. Of course, it is worth noting that not all Loyalists chose to go north. Quite a few fled to East and West Florida, which had remained loyal to the Crown throughout the war, the so-called 14th and 15th colonies that Americans rarely talk about. Unfortunately, Britain ceded the Floridas back to Spain in the Peace of 1783, so the Loyalists who had settled there had to move again. The next most popular destination was the various British possessions in the Caribbean, where the Loyalists hoped to resume their plantation lifestyle with the thousands of slaves they brought along. Even those black Loyalists, who the Crown had freed on record, were sometimes re-enslaved and shipped off to plantations, numbering in the hundreds. But what about those Loyalists who stayed behind? These 500,000 people had no chance to organize politically because survival required total assimilation. To keep their heads, and hopefully some of their property, they had to swear allegiance to the new republic, pay their taxes, and stop toasting the king. Children of Loyalists grew up hearing the heroic tales of the patriots and were never allowed to ask why their grandpa had been on vacation during the war. And so, within a generation, the Loyalist identity had completely vanished, leaving behind only dusty property records and some very bitter letters in the Canadian archives. In any case, my friends, if you enjoyed this look into the darker side of American independence, consider declaring your loyalty to us on Patreon. Your support ensures that we don't have to flee to Canada to escape the tyranny of the YouTube algorithm. Make sure to check out our friends over at MyHeritage to discover just how far back your family tree goes and tell us about your most surprising ancestor. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for the next revolutionarily loyal episode of SideQuest. What was the Loyalists' favorite drink? Loyal tea.